the next stage is drawing some inferences. So the first thing I'd like you to do is, without necessarily thinking too hard about the past or the future of this stand, first let's just think about what those observations we have seen told us. So first off, I'd like you to think about what caused this in particular, and that big cedar shell that I showed behind you. I'd like you to think about what caused that. So pause the video for 2 minutes and write down what you think led to these being here. All right, first this here. When I look at this, this tells me human disturbance. This tells me logging. Now it's a little funny because it's very tall, and that's unusual. Today when we do logging, usually trees are cut as close to the ground as possible. Maybe about 30 centimeters above the ground is kind of standard. So this is kind of funny that that would fall from, that tree was cut off up high. And you might have thought that, because of that, you might have thought that that tree had fallen, had maybe had some rot and it broke off in the wind. So if that was the case though, if we looked around, we would probably see the rest of this tree. Since this part has not rotted yet, we would expect to see the rest of the tree nearby that had fallen. And we don't see that, so that's a clue to us that this was logging. I know a little bit about the history of the stand, and I know that when they harvested these big trees, they often harvested them a bit above the ground. In part because some of these trees had flare, and it made those logs harder to mill and harder to be removed from the stand if they were very much wider at the bottom. And also some of these old trees had rot in them. And you can imagine if you're cutting down a tree, especially with a crosscut saw long ago, if it's a solid tree, you know precisely, you have a pretty good idea when the amount of wood that's left is going to be little enough that it will break and fall. But if the tree is rotting, you might think that there's lots of solid tree left, and suddenly there isn't, and that tree is going to fall. So if you cut that tree a little bit farther up, it's more likely that you're going to be in solid wood, and the tree will fall exactly when you intend it to. So that would be a little bit safer. I can see a little bit of bark left on this tree. That's something that you would look at. And I can see this is a Douglas fir. Okay, and the tree back behind us here, I'll walk over there. I'm not going to walk all the way over there, but I'll stand in the direction so you can see. That tree has definitely burned. So there's definitely char in there. So that tells us that that tree was in a fire. It doesn't tell us if the tree was alive or dead when the fire burned, but it tells us if there was a fire. And when you see some of these trees that are harvested, oh, I should back up just a little bit. I also see a few other of these stumps that are 2 or 3 meters tall around here. That's another hint that these trees were cut, and it wasn't something like rot that fell down. It's not out of the question that there would be a tree that had some rot and broke off 2 or 3 meters up, but it would be a bit unusual to see. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I see 6 stumps, 7, there's one back behind this one. So I see about 7 stumps that have been cut at about the same height and are in about the same stage of decay. So that also is a sign that this was harvesting. On some of these logs, you'll see what's called the springboard notches, or some of these stumps. I don't see one on these right here, but I'll try to point one out later on. And in Pacific Spirit Park here, there was a fire. There was a fire about 100 years ago. And most of the harvesting happened before the fire. And we can tell that in part just from the history, but also if you look at some of these standing stumps and you see some of those springboard notches, you can see charring on the inside of those springboard notches. So that gives you a clue that that springboard notch was already cut into the tree when the fire happened. There were actually a few different fires, so some of the, and there was also some salvage logging here at some point after a fire went through. Trees that had been killed were harvested. So now I'd like you to think a little bit about stand history, and I already gave you some hints. I kind of gave it away. That's okay though, because when you're doing this for the first time, it's pretty challenging. So I would like you, based on the observations and not just what I said, to take 2 minutes and write down what you think happened in this stand that resulted in it looking the way it does. And in part, not just what I said, but also why it looks the way it does today, why we are seeing the species that we are. And then I'd also like you to take about 2 minutes and write about what you think this stand might look like in the future based on what we've found. Okay, pause the video and do that. let's start with the history. So obviously I already told you this forest was harvested and had a big fire. So you have some idea about the starting conditions of that stand. If you didn't know that, you would have seen, we saw that charring back there, so that would have told you that there's fire here. It wouldn't have told you exactly when. We could core some of these trees and count the rings and figure out their ages, and we would find out that just about all of these trees are the same size, or sorry, are the same age, and they're about 100 years old right now. So that would give us a clue that it was a severe disturbance and the trees were about, and that happened about 100 years ago. What's a little bit funny, a lot of the Douglas fir around here are about the same size, so that might lead you to believe that they started growing at about the same time. These cedars that I'm seeing that are in the intermediate level of the canopy, so maybe about 2/3 the height of the Douglas fir, you might think, oh yeah, those are younger trees. I would guess if we cored them though, that most of those would be the same age as those Douglas fir. And you should, hopefully, that should make sense to you because you know that Douglas fir is an early successional, very fast-growing, shade-intolerant tree. So you would expect that if there was a severe disturbance, a severe stand-initiating disturbance, those Douglas fir are going to grow fast. They're going to reach the canopy, control the canopy, grow very fast, whereas the western red cedars and the western hemlocks, some of these little ones might have been more recent regeneration, but ones you see in the intermediate layer of the canopy, those trees probably germinated and started growing around the same time as the Douglas fir, but the Douglas fir quickly overtopped them and shaded them out. But these trees are quite shade tolerant actually, so they can just continue growing okay in the understory. They're going to grow very slowly if they're in shade, but they're going to mostly continue to be healthy trees. So that tells us a little bit about what was going on here. All right, now for the future, these stands can be really long-lived, these coastal western hemlock stands. So it's possible if we came back 100 years from now, and there wasn't a severe disturbance and we kind of ignore climate change because that's a big wild card, it's possible that this stand would look pretty similar. What we'd probably be seeing, and this progression would continue going on in time, some of these mature Douglas firs are going to die. Some of them are going to die of old age. Some of them might die from small disturbances like being blown down in the wind throw, or maybe some fungal pathogens that don't kill the whole stand but will kill a few trees here and there. So some of those Douglas fir are going to die. But there's no Douglas fir regeneration. Remember when we looked around, we didn't see any Douglas fir regeneration. And that's because it's a shade-intolerant tree species, so it can't regenerate in these conditions. So we've got some Douglas fir that are going to be leaving the stand, but none that are going to be recruiting into the stand. So the proportion of Douglas fir is going to decrease. And as that happens, we see we've got a lot of these real nice western red cedars that are pretty tall already, but not quite in the canopy. As those Douglas fir die, we would expect those to take over those spaces in the canopy. So over time, we would expect to see more western red cedar in the canopy and also more western hemlock in the canopy. And those species we are seeing regeneration from because they're very shade-tolerant species. So we have some of those trees might die, but there's probably more coming in than are dying. So over time, this canopy is going to transition into being mostly western red cedar and western hemlock. So that's what we would probably expect in the future, assuming there wasn't some severe stand-initiating disturbance. So you can't always just look around and say, oh, I see these trees in the understory, so those will be the trees that we see in the future. You have to know a little bit about the ecology of those trees and the sylvics, knowing about their growth characteristics, their shade tolerance. So that's why I was saying earlier on, you need to have good observation skills, but you also need to have some foundational knowledge about disturbance here, about the trees that are growing here, and to be able to put it all together. And back to disturbance for just a second. In coastal western hemlock forests, big fires, big stand-initiating fires do happen, but they tend to happen on the scale of once over 1 or more centuries. So they don't happen very often, whereas these small gap disturbances tend to happen quite frequently. Even just since I've been here, I've seen trees that have fallen. So that's going to be the process that's really driving this forest in the future.